What if I told you that at the turn of the 20th century, the world's elite were running massive baby factories in plain sight? What if the grand world fairs you've seen in history books, those magnificent white cities that appeared overnight and then vanished just as quickly, were actually cover operations for something far more sinister? What if thousands, maybe millions of children weren't born naturally, but were artificially grown in glass incubators and then distributed across the world to repopulate empty cities? This isn't science fiction. This is the hidden history of Tartaria, and today we're going to expose the shocking truth about the baby incubator exhibitions that appeared at world fairs across America and Europe. We're talking about the St. Louis World's Fair, the Omaha Trans-Mississippi Exposition, Coney Island's Luna Park, and dozens of other locations where something called incubator baby exhibits drew millions of curious spectators. The official story says these were medical demonstrations to save premature infants. But when you dig deeper, when you follow the evidence, when you connect the dots between the mud floods, the orphan trains, and the mysterious repopulation of the American frontier, a very different picture emerges. Before we dive into the evidence, let me be clear about what we're discussing here. We're examining Tartaria conspiracy theories, the orphan train movement, World's Fair exhibitions, and the baby incubator phenomenon that swept through the early 1900s. These four elements are interconnected in ways that the mainstream historians refuse to acknowledge. They want you to believe these were separate, unrelated events, but the timeline, the scale, and the deliberate erasure of records tell a different story entirely. The question isn't whether baby factories existed. They did. You can find the photographs, the newspaper articles, the admission tickets. The question is why? Why were thousands of infants on public display in glass boxes at entertainment venues? Why were millions of orphaned children suddenly appearing across America during the same period? Why did the magnificent cities of the world fairs, complete with advanced infrastructure and stunning architecture, get demolished immediately after the exhibitions ended? And most importantly, who were these children really, and where did they come from? Let's start with what we can prove. In 1896, a man named Martin Cooney introduced the baby incubator exhibit to America at the Berlin World's Fair. He claimed to be a student of the famous French obstetrician Pierre Constant Boudin, though interestingly, there's no official record of Cooney ever receiving a medical degree from any recognized institute. Nevertheless, Cooney brought his incubator exhibit to Coney Island, where it ran continuously from 1903 to 1940. Think about that for a moment. For 40 years, there was a permanent baby factory operating at an amusement park. The official narrative is that Cooney was saving premature babies whose parents couldn't afford hospital care. He charged the public 25 cents to view these infants in their glass incubators and supposedly used the admission fees to fund the operation. We're told he saved thousands of lives and revolutionized neonatal care. The story is heartwarming, noble even, but it falls apart the moment you examine the logistics. Where were all these premature babies coming from? Cooney's facility at Coney Island could house up to 8 infants at a time. Over 40 years of operation, he claimed to have treated approximately 8,000 babies with a survival rate of 85%. That's an extraordinary number. But here's what doesn't make sense. Premature birth rates in that era were roughly the same as today, around 10% of all births. Yet somehow, Cooney had a constant supply of premature infants whose parents were willing to hand them over to a man with no medical credentials to put them on display at a carnival. The parents weren't charged for the care. They signed their babies over, and Cooney kept them for weeks or months until they gained enough weight to survive outside the incubator. During this time, the babies were on public display, with thousands of paying customers walking past their glass boxes every day. Nurses in starched uniforms tended to them, while carnival barkers shouted outside, advertising the miracle babies and the scientific wonder of incubation technology. Now, let's connect this to the world fairs themselves. These weren't small local exhibitions. We're talking about massive temporary cities built on scales that boggle the mind. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair covered 690 acres and attracted 27 million visitors in an era when the entire population of the United States was only 63 million. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was even larger, covering 1,200 acres with over 1,500 buildings. These structures weren't simple wooden shacks. They were architectural marvels, neoclassical palaces, and advanced exhibition halls with electricity, running water, and sophisticated infrastructure. The official story is that these cities were built in a year or two by construction crews, then demolished immediately after the fairs ended, because they were temporary structures made of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber. But anyone who's looked at the photographs can see these weren't flimsy temporary buildings. The level of craftsmanship, the scale of the construction, the advanced engineering required to build these cities in such a short time, it doesn't add up, especially when you consider that this was happening before modern construction equipment, before cranes, before power tools as we know them today. Here's where the Tartaria connection becomes impossible to ignore. The theory suggests that these weren't new constructions at all. They were pre-existing cities from a previous advanced civilization, Tartaria, which had been destroyed or depopulated by a series of catastrophic mud floods in the mid to late 1800s. The World Fairs were a cover story, a way to reintroduce these magnificent structures to a reprogrammed population who had no memory of the previous civilization. The evidence for the mud floods is extensive. Photographs from the 1800s show buildings across America, Europe, and Asia with their first floors buried underground. We call them basement levels now. But look at the architecture. Those lower levels have grand windows, ornate details, and decorative elements that make no sense if they were designed to be underground. The official explanation is that streets were raised over time due to flooding, infrastructure improvements, or landfill projects. But this happened simultaneously in hundreds of cities across multiple continents. That's not gradual urban development. That's a coordinated reset. After the mud floods, you would have magnificent empty cities, beautiful architecture, advanced infrastructure, but no people. This is where the baby factories and orphan trains enter the picture. If you needed to repopulate entire continents, where would you get the people? You couldn't just import adults because adults have memories, languages, and cultural identities that would contradict the new historical narrative being constructed. But children, especially infants, they're blank slates. Let's talk about the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 250,000 orphaned, abandoned, or homeless children were transported from the cities of the East Coast to rural areas in the Midwest and West. That's the official number. Some researchers believe the actual figure could be double or triple that amount when you account for undocumented transfers, international adoptions, and children sent to Canada, Australia, and other British colonies. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, was the primary organization behind this mass movement. The stated goal was to remove poor children from the corrupting influence of city slums and place them with farm families who would provide them with moral upbringing and work opportunities. Brace himself wrote that these children were the dangerous classes who would grow up to be criminals if left in the cities. But here's what's strange. The sudden explosion of orphans in the mid-1800s corresponds exactly with the timeline of the alleged mud flood. You would expect orphan populations to fluctuate based on wars, epidemics, or economic depression. Yet the records show a massive, sustained wave of orphaned children appearing in American cities for decades, far beyond what would be explained by normal social conditions. Where were all these children coming from? The official records are suspiciously vague. Many of these children were described as foundlings, babies discovered on doorsteps or left at churches with no information about their parents. Others were supposedly surrendered by destitute mothers who couldn't afford to raise them. But the scale doesn't match historical patterns of poverty or family breakdown. Here's where it gets even stranger. Many of the orphan-trained children had no memory of their biological parents. They were often very young, toddlers or infants, which made it easier to place them with new families. The Children's Aid Society and similar organizations didn't keep detailed records of the children's origin. In many cases, the children's names were changed, their birth dates were estimated, and their backgrounds were deliberately obscured. This is exactly what you would do if you were trying to introduce artificially created or mysteriously sourced children into society without raising questions about their origin. You would make them young enough that they couldn't tell their own stories. You would separate siblings to prevent them from corroborating each other's memories. You would scatter them across vast geographic distances to make it harder for anyone to notice patterns. And you would destroy or obscure the paper trail to prevent future investigators from connecting the dots. Now back to the baby incubators. These exhibits appeared at world fairs during the exact same period as the orphan train movement. The 1896 Berlin exhibition, the 1897 Omaha Trans-Mississippi Exposition, the 1898 London Stanley Show, the 1901 Buffalo Pan American Expo, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, all of these featured baby incubator exhibits. The exhibits were always popular attractions, drawing enormous crowds of curious spectators who paid to watch infants struggling to survive in their glass boxes. Think about the psychological operation at work here. You take a population that has been through a catastrophic reset, that has lost its connection to the previous advanced civilization, and you show them miracle technology that can keep premature babies alive. You condition them to accept that these children are being saved by modern medical science. You normalize the idea of babies being raised in artificial environments, separated from their biological mothers, cared for by uniformed nurses in clinical settings. What if the baby incubators weren't just medical demonstration? What if they were acclimation centers, places where the public could be gradually introduced to the concept of artificially raised children? What if the children on display weren't premature babies at all, but the product of whatever process was being used to rapidly generate the population needed to fill the empty cities left behind by Tartaria? Let's examine the technology itself. The incubators used by Cooney and others were sophisticated devices for their time, with temperature controls, humidity regulation, and oxygen delivery system. But incubator technology wasn't new. The ancient Egyptians had artificial incubation methods for hatching chicken eggs. The Chinese used similar techniques. Yet, we're supposed to believe that the idea of using controlled heat and humidity to sustain premature human infants didn't occur to medical science until the late 1800s. What if incubator technology was actually recovered, Tartarian tech? What if the baby exhibits at world fairs were a limited hangout, a way of reintroducing advanced reproductive or child-rearing technology from the previous civilization by presenting it as a modern medical innovation? You wouldn't show the public the full extent of the technology. You would give them a watered-down version, just enough to serve the immediate purpose of normalizing artificial child-rearing while hiding the true capabilities. There's another disturbing element to consider. Many of the babies in these exhibits were described as preemies, but photographs from the era show infants who appear completely healthy and normal size. If you look at historical images of Cooney's Coney Island exhibit or similar displays, you'll notice that many of the babies don't look premature at all. They look like full-term infants who are simply being kept in glass boxes for public. Why would healthy babies be displayed in incubators? The official explanation is that they were being monitored after graduating from intensive care, or that they were examples of successful treatment. But this raises more questions than it answers. If the babies were healthy enough to leave intensive care, why keep them on public display? Why not return them to their parents? Why extend their stay in a carnival environment when they could be developing normally in a home setting? Unless, of course, they had no parents to return to. Unless they were part of a large-scale operation to introduce orphaned or artificially created children into society using the cover of medical advancement. Let's talk about the demolition of the World Fair cities. This is one of the most suspicious aspects of the entire phenomenon. After the exhibitions ended, these magnificent structures were systematically destroyed. Not repurposed, not preserved, but demolished. The official reason given was that they were temporary structures that had served their purpose. But this doesn't explain why so much effort and resources would be invested in building these architectural marvels only to tear them down months later. The Tartaria theory provides a more logical explanation. These weren't new construction. They were pre-existing cities that had survived the mud floods, but were empty of their original population. The World Fairs served multiple purposes. They were a way to discover these cities and introduce them to the post-reset population. They were also a way to assess which structures could be kept and integrated into the new historical narrative, and which needed to be destroyed because they contained too much evidence of the previous advanced civilization. The buildings that were demolished after the fairs were likely those that contained technology, inscriptions, or architectural features that would have raised too many questions about the official timeline of human development. The buildings that were preserved, like the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco or the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, were sanitized first, stripped of their most revealing elements, and then reintegrated as supposedly new construction. During the transitional period of the World Fairs, when these cities were temporarily reopened, the baby incubator exhibits served a crucial function. They were part of the repopulation strategy. They conditioned the public to accept the presence of unexplained children. They provided a cover story for where new population was coming from. And they laid the psychological groundwork for the massive orphan train movement that would distribute these children across the continent. Consider the timeline. The mud floods allegedly occurred throughout the mid to late 1800s, with major events in the 1870s and 1880s. The first orphan trains began in 1854, but the movement dramatically accelerated in the 1880s and 1890s. The baby incubator exhibits appeared at world fairs starting in 1896. All of these elements converge in a roughly 50-year period that corresponds with the proposed Tartarian reset. There's also the matter of the children's physical characteristics. Researchers who have studied orphan train records and photographs note that many of these children were described as unusually beautiful, with fine features and an almost ethereal quality. This could simply be the result of selection bias, as organizations might have prioritized attractive children for adoption. But it's also consistent with the theory that these children came from an advanced civilization with superior genetics or development methods. Some of the orphan-trained children reportedly had unusual abilities or knowledge that couldn't be explained by their supposed background. There are accounts of young children demonstrating advanced literacy, mathematical abilities, or technical knowledge that didn't match their stated age or education level. These cases were usually dismissed as children being smarter than expected, but they could also indicate that the children had received advanced education before being placed into the orphan system. The scale of the cover-up becomes apparent when you try to research these topics in official historical record. Information about the orphan trains is scattered and incomplete. Many of the original documents were destroyed, lost, or are inaccessible to researchers. The Children's Aid Society's early records are fragmentary at best. The baby incubator exhibits, despite being major attractions at world fairs attended by millions, have left remarkably little documentary evidence. Martin Cooney himself is a mystery. Despite running his exhibits for decades and supposedly saving thousands of lives, there's no official medical record of his credentials, training, or licensing. His obituary in 1950 described him as a physician and pioneer of neonatology, but attempts to verify his medical education have come up empty. It's as if he appeared out of nowhere, ran one of the most successful medical demonstrations in history, and then disappeared back into obscurity. Why would someone with no verifiable credentials be allowed to operate a medical facility for 40 years? Why would parents trust him with their premature infant? Why would hospitals, which were developing their own neonatology departments, refer cases to a carnival sideshow rather than treating them in proper medical settings? The only logical answer is that Cooney wasn't operating outside the system. He was part of the system. His exhibits had official sanction because they were serving an official purpose. That purpose wasn't medical innovation, it was population management. Let's discuss the international dimension. The baby incubator exhibits and orphan train movements weren't limited to America. Similar programs existed in Britain, France, Germany, and other European countries. The British Home Children Program sent over 100,000 children to Canada between 1869 and the late 1930s. Australia received thousands of child migrants, many of whom were told their parents were dead when in fact they were alive. This was a global operation. Whatever happened to depopulate the world during the Tartarian mud floods required a coordinated international response to repopulate. The baby factories and orphan distribution systems were the mechanism by which the reset was completed. New populations were introduced, given new histories, and integrated into the rebuilt or repurposed cities of the previous civilization. The children themselves would have no memory of their true origin. Raised by adoptive families, educated in the new historical narrative, they would grow up believing they were simply orphans who had been given a second chance. Their children and grandchildren would have no reason to question the official story. Within a few generations, the reset would be complete, and the truth would be buried under layers of false memory and constructed history. There's one more piece of evidence that ties this all together. In the early 1900s, around the same time as the baby incubator exhibits and the peak of the orphan train movement, there was a sudden obsession in popular culture with eugenics, population management, and social engineering. The Progressive Era reformers talked constantly about improving the human race, controlling who could reproduce, and managing population quality. This wasn't random. It was part of the same agenda. The people running the reset understood that they weren't just repopulating the world, they were reshaping it. They wanted to create a new type of human, one that would fit into their vision of society. The baby factories weren't just about quantity, they were about quality control. This is why the incubator exhibits were always described in terms of saving babies and improving survival rates. It was eugenic language disguised as humanitarian concern. The babies on display were examples of the new improved human being, raised in controlled scientific environments rather than natural family settings. The adoptive families who took in orphan-trained children were screened and selected. They had to meet certain criteria, demonstrate certain values, and agree to raise the children according to specific principles. This wasn't charity. It was a breeding program, a way of ensuring that the new population would develop with the desired characteristics and beliefs. And it worked. The generation raised by the orphan-trained system went on to become productive citizens of the new American society. They built careers, raised families, and never questioned their origins. They had no reason to. They had been given the gift of a home and a family. Why would they look deeper? But some did. Over the years, orphan-trained riders and their descendants began searching for information about their biological family. What they found, or rather didn't find, was troubling. Records were missing, destroyed, or deliberately obscured. Birth certificates didn't exist. Family histories ended abruptly. It was as if these children had appeared out of nowhere. The same is true for many of the incubator babies. Martin Cooney supposedly kept records of all the children he treated, but these records were never made public. When he died in 1950, his files disappeared. Some former incubator babies tried to find their medical records in later life, only to discover that nothing existed. No admission forms, no treatment notes, no discharge papers. It was as if their time in the incubators had been erased from history. This is the hallmark of a cover-up. When information is systematically destroyed or hidden, it's because someone doesn't want the truth to come out. The people behind the Tartarian reset understood that future generations might start asking questions, so they made sure there would be no evidence to find. But they couldn't destroy everything. The photographs remain. The newspaper articles remain. The physical structures, those that weren't demolished, remain. And most importantly, the stories remain. The orphan train riders who passed down oral histories to their grandchildren, the incubator babies who remembered their time in the glass boxes, the researchers who refused to accept the official narrative and kept digging. So what's the shocking truth? The truth is that at the turn of the 20th century, the world underwent a massive reset following the destruction of an advanced civilization we now call Tartaria. The magnificent cities left behind by this civilization were repurposed through staged events called world fairs. The missing population was replaced through a coordinated system of artificial child rearing and mass orphan distribution. Baby incubator exhibits at these fairs served as psychological conditioning and cover for the introduction of mysteriously sourced children. The orphan trains distributed these children across continents, giving them new identities and erasing their true origin. Within 2 generations, the reset was complete, and humanity forgot it had ever happened. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The mud-buried buildings, the demolished fair cities, the millions of unexplained orphans, the baby factories operating openly as entertainment. It all points to the same conclusion. We are living in a post-reset civilization, and the baby incubators were how they repopulated the world after Tartaria fell. The system doesn't want you to know this because it would destroy the entire framework of modern historical understanding. But the truth is emerging. One photograph, one document, one story at a time. The age of deception is ending, and the age of remembering has begun.